Welcome to Inspiring STEM's podcast program highlighting innovations in scientific publishing and science communications. We are interviewing key opinion leaders and organizations working to advance and quite often to disrupt the status quo. My name is Martin Delahunty and I will be your host. My guest for this episode is Professor Mark Hutchinson. Mark is director for the Centre for Nanoscale BioPhotonics in Adelaide. The centre is a $50 million Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence that brings together researchers from around the world to create light-based sensing technologies to create windows into the body. These advances will enable scientific breakthroughs and advance the health outcomes of tomorrow. Under his leadership, the centre has translated fundamental science discoveries from the lab bench into economic value in the boardroom, forging 30 industry partnerships and creating 15 startups and spinoffs. Mark is also president of Science and Technology Australia, the peak body representing more than 90,000 scientists and technologists, and serving as an influential voice for evidence and expertise in public policy. A very warm welcome, Mark, to the program.
Martin, thank you very much for having me. And as tradition here in Australia, I acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Kaurna people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledging the enduring connection to country that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have here in the world's longest living continuous culture here in Great Southland.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. Thank you. Before we get into talking about your current work and perhaps what your priority is at the moment, could you share a little bit about your background and what led you to the career that you have now?
Yeah, sure. So for those listening, perhaps of the younger age, if they ever do get onto your podcast, Martin, the hope is derived from the fact that I was a terrible student. I did not enjoy school at all. To the extent that I didn't have dyslexia, but I had a reading difficulty and a writing difficulty, which meant I was encrypting knowledge as I wrote in my handwriting because I just was an absolutely terrible student. And it wasn't until I was in university that I found the hands and minds connection in and around experimental science. And that was where, I'd always been interested in how things worked, but it was actually how things worked using reductionist scientific methods that let me get into the fundamental sciences. And long story short, undergraduate degree in Bachelor of Science, majoring in pharmacology and immunology, PhD in medicine in drug development pharmacology, some genetics, as well as a lot of immunology. And then the next step was going into industry and working as a clinical trials manager for a few years and finally cracking that elusive funding in Australia for a postdoc to head to the US to work with the world leaders of Professor Linda Watkins and Professor Steve Mayer at the University of Colorado in a team of 40 postdocs, 120 students. It was just amazing. Pig in mud stuff. And we were working on the beginnings of the brain glue, the understanding of the immunology in the brain and how that, what we thought was just glue, just holding the brain and spinal cord together, was actually playing a pivotal role in brain function, specifically for my interest into pain. And then my drug side, how could we do stuff about it with pharmaceutical interventions? And this was all in the early 2000s. And it was this groundswell of excitement and everything we did was new. It was a completely untrodden path. And so that allowed me to gain collaborative skills and surgical techniques and then establish my team back here in Australia in the neuroimmunopharmacology group. And since then, it's been grant and fellowship to contract research project to commercialization to leading a centre of excellence in nanoscale biophotonics, which at its first instance looks nothing like a background in neuroscience, immunology and neurosurgery, but actually arises from scientific frustration needing to generate innovative solutions. And why not go and talk to your friendly local physicist to find that solution? So that's sort of where we've landed today. And it's been an honour and privilege to have that leadership role of 200 brilliant scientists across the country and internationally to literally create new technology-based windows into the body.
a sort of fascinating intersection between physics and medicine and biology. Maybe for even those scholarly science communication experts out there, maybe explain what biophotonics is in relation to your work.
Yeah, so the simplest form of biophotonics is a light-matter interaction. We can think of this, especially in COVID days, when we've seen pulse oximeters, which is that lovely red light that goes on your finger that tells you how much blood oxygen saturation you have. That is biophotonics in action. That is a red light that's interacting with the hemoglobin that has oxygen bound to it, and you are getting a percentage readout of the oxygen saturation in your blood. Now, that is a perfect example of a mass-produced diode that is generating a light that is then having a very, very clinically important measurement, which you can now buy on eBay or AliExpress or Amazon or at your local pharmacy almost for a few bucks. Now, back in the day, that was an expensive technology. That was a very, very high-end piece of kit. Our centre spent and spends a long time taking what would be the origins of that type of technology that looks nothing like a simple battery-powered consumer-level piece of kit. We start with a multi-million-dollar laser, some fibre optics, some people walking around with white lab coats and laser goggles on, firing light to biology that's held by tweezers or sitting in a dish or literally on the stable table laser setup, asking the question, what new biology can we gain an understanding of through this light-matter interaction? And it might be simple light. It might just be simple lots of photons hitting lots of biology without any structure or additional information. But we can do so much with light now. We can shape it, we can sculpt it, we can pulse it in at unique frequencies of interval frequencies, as well as the wavelengths. It then gives us an opportunity to place unique biology that may have been pre-treated or have a unique sensor within it. And all of that is linked to who gives a damn? It's having an impact, making a measurement that never has been before possible, either because literally we didn't have the science to be able to do this, or economically it was never viable to actually do this type of work. And so all of that fundamental science discovery has then been linked to this program of work of identifying an end user need. And some of those end user needs that we've had that have been spun out have been, does this brilliant lamb, good as quality Australian, clean and green Aussie farmed lamb, turn into a really good chop on the barbecue? And how do we actually measure eating quality at line speed to advance market access for quality Australian products? Very important for a UK trade deal, Mark.
Absolutely.
So we've got lasers now in abattoirs firing off light into carcasses as they're going past at line speed, measuring eating quality and predicting, should this go to the top-end restaurant or should it just be, heading to the kids' netball or soccer game on the weekend barbecue? That is direct translation, fundamental science discovery at the lab bench, literally taking it through the boardroom, generating venture capital investment into these entities to then actually deploy these out there and to have jobs created with physicists walking around in abattoirs helping the industry persist into a new era.
And Mark, that's a beautiful and fantastic demonstration of science communications in action, storytelling, telling the fascination of science and the translation of science into real world good. And I know how passionate you are also about science communications. We can maybe come back to talking about science communications generally, but maybe because I'm aware that you wear many hats at the moment. And I'm wondering how you juggle your priorities and what your current priorities are. Yes,
so I'm highly interesting, and therefore I'm very conflicted in the many roles that I have. As the President of Science and Technology Australia, the peak body in Australia that represents the scientists from and technologists from undergraduates right through to the esteemed fellows. There's over 110,000 members that we represent now, and it is just a privilege and an honour to be able to speak to our elected officials, to government officials, to industry about the passion and desire for science and technology to create solutions. But in order to do that, there needs to be a little bit of greasing of the wheels, and so therefore funding and policy levers are really, really important for us to advocate for. So that takes a lot of my time, but that's on top of my leading of my 21-strong team here within the University of Adelaide in the neuroimmunopharmacology group. I'm also on the founding steering committee for the Animal Welfare Collaborative across Australia, which is a not-for-profit organisation that seeks to advance the welfare and well-being of animals broadly, but specifically my interest there is in the pain in animals, and specifically the animals in pain in livestock. I spend a lot of time working with and for the Department of Defence in Australia in and around human biotechnologies and unique measurement capabilities, and in extracting that information out. We're living in a really interesting but challenging world at the moment, and how we can navigate this world in its changing environments, keeping humans safe. And so I'm doing a lot of work with fundamental research discovery to create the measurements that allow us to know that someone is safe. And the final piece would be the work that I do with the Safeguarding Australia through Biotechnology Response and Engagement Alliance, which sounds like a mouthful. We call it the SABRE Alliance. It is seeking to create this convergence opportunity across Australian Defence Forces and Defence Science Technology Group into the med tech space, so the development of new pharmaceuticals through to medical technologies, and then across to the agricultural sector and ag tech, and identifying that when we start thinking about what appear to be three fundamentally diverse fields with no apparent links, if we look at the technology requirements and the knowledge acquisition requirements in each of those spaces, case in point, wound repair. Humans having surgery need optimized wound repair. Injuries associated with metabolic disorders like diabetes, ulceration, wound repair. War. There's some wounds that occur in war. We need very deployable solutions. And then we have animals getting injured out in the field, animals that are surgically treated, small animals, all needing wound repair. Why make a solution that is only for human medical practice when we're dealing fundamentally with the cells and systems that are very translatable to human medicine, defence and ag? And by introducing that capability across the different components of the network of systems of industry, government, academia and defence forces, suddenly we start to have this magic sauce coming together, and it creates a sustainability. Now, in some countries, you don't need to do that. In Australia, we really need to do that. We're not big enough to do everything. We have to be Jacks and Jills of all trades. So let's make sure our technology and science solutions are Jacking and Jilling of all trading it as well.
Good. Now, I understand from our briefing call last time, the Australian government recently announced plans to refresh its science and research priorities and the country's national science statement. You're part of that national consultation. Could you explain a little more about the process, the goals, and also how important open science and open access publishing is to delivering on those goals?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it is exciting to be in science and technology in Australia at the moment because the current government are actively looking and reviewing and exploring every element. So yes, there is a review of the national science priorities. There is a review of the Australian Research Council that I'm participating in with two other people. There is a review of the entire higher education sector. There are explorations and new schemes getting set up for university research commercialisation to the tune of nearly $2.5 billion. All of these are really saying, I think, and not speaking on behalf of government here, but I think what they're saying is Australian national science and research priorities are an opportunity to shape the future of the science and technology sector and make them crucial to the heartbeat of what Australia is actually doing today. With the acknowledgement that we, in the Caucasian white Australia, are actually not the first scientists of this country. And this review that the Chief Scientist, Kathy Foley, is undertaking is for the first time, shamefully in our history, but excitingly going forward, an amplification of First Nation science and scientists to advance our understanding as a community of the opportunities that are presented to us to learn from the oldest continuing culture on Earth today. This means that there's a lot of growing to be done. There's a lot of talking and yarning to be had. There's also an understanding of where the policy levers are to enable fundamental science and technology discovery at the same time as enabling the complication of our economy to actually grow jobs, grow wealth, grow solutions that we urgently need for things that are challenging the globe today. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is an appetite that if $1 is spent into science and technology, invested into science and technology, it could actually flip out to a return on investment, both in human capital, societal capital, but also in economic growth. And that's a big ask for the chief scientist to sculpt what are very complicated, dynamic, and yet critical roles for science and technology for the country, but also at the rock bed of this current government.
And you were just thinking again about open science and open access publishing. Do you see any barriers to implementing Kathy Foley's vision for open access in Australia?
Oh, listen, I think for us in science discovery, it has been commonplace for us to communicate our science to our academic peers in a form that happens to be in a published journal. The fact that many of those scientific discoveries are then hidden behind paywalls is an unfortunate and yet probably historically necessary process to enable a sustainable industry. However, when a nation is investing a large amount of taxpayer dollars and the nation are receptive to listening to that available science, we need a way to make scientific discoveries accessible to the nation, who at the end of the day have enabled it through taxpayer investment. So the vision for an open access to Australian discoveries that are published is a noble one, and one that I'm quite passionate about ensuring we can get to, because there is a need for Australian businesses, Australian communities to have access to this knowledge that happens to be published in scientific papers. As we start looking to a future of machine learning and other distillation techniques of simplifying or augmenting the communication away from stupid technical jargon that we don't necessarily need to use all the time. Having open access allows for that synthesizing of knowledge. But then as we start looking to an international community, we can truly be a sort of a light on the hill of best practice, of establishing best practice science out the door, getting high quality peer-reviewed evidence and revising of hypotheses occurring, not hidden away in academic sectors, hidden away by paywalls, but occurring in a public place, in open access, so that then the community can see, oh, this makes sense. There's 300 papers that I can see that are on this one topic, and they've iterated through a journey to then create the hypothesis that we have today that is the peak of the knowledge that we have. Now, in and around that, I don't think we can just then publish this work in these forms of an introduction, a methods, a results, and then a discussion, QED, publish, off we go. We need to evolve our scientific communication practice to actually address modern forms of communication. Great that we had the printing press discovered. Love it. I think we've gone on from digital printing presses now to new forms of comms. Let's see if we can harness that to enable scientific discourse to occur well into the future.
And one of the lots of benefits there for open access, which has been well communicated, generally, but then there are always concerns around intellectual property and making open data accessible, and then having the need to protect. And I think in the case of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, protecting cultural sensitivities, but also you talked about drawing on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island culture for new discoveries, innovations. And I had that conversation with Kylie Walker as well from the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, and so we had the same concerns about protecting intellectual property. But you had a little idea in our briefing call as to how we might do that.
Yeah. So on the point of Indigenous knowledge and research with Indigenous knowledge stakeholders, we cannot any longer do the extraction of knowledge from ancient knowledge systems and then publish these things because it's an investigation of a people. That is inappropriate. We know that now. We must correct the wrong and move forward, but the adoption of the best practice guidelines from Indigenous communities and knowledge stakeholders that have put out there to say, if we want to work together in exploring this fantastic opportunity that is there in over 40,000 years of knowledge systems development, let's do it together. Let's explore this. But then critically, as you pointed to, the sovereign data ownership, artifact ownership and access is such a critical part, because my schema has been broken last year in my understanding of what we mean by time and space and connection to country. Connection to country for me, I thought, was the geography. Indigenous peoples lived here, therefore they had a connection, like I have a connection to my home, my property. No, this is 40,000 years worth of connection. I can only speak to myself and my family being in this country for the last 120 years. This is a deep connection. And so therefore, there is knowledge in the country. There is knowledge in the people. There is knowledge in artifacts. How we go through open access into that, this is where we can't go black and white scenario of this is the binary. This is how we do it for everything. We need to maintain the full hue of the rainbow of opportunities to explore these domains, with Indigenous knowledge systems being a well-trodden path of excellent examples of where we should move together in the future with respect of sovereign data. Now, intellectual property is very different to this space from the Indigenous knowledge systems, but I think we can actually learn a lot from having respect for the origin of data and sharing the outcomes of knowledge from the interrogation of those fundamental ideas respectfully into the future. And that includes not always telling all of the background information on day one of the story and actually building a greater understanding of what the space is. And intellectual property for commercialization use, for example, not of Indigenous knowledge, but broadly in other fundamental sciences discovery, we need to evolve our understanding of what is actually commercializable. An idea in and of itself, most of the time, I'd say 95 to 98% of the time, is not commercializable. You need to put some additional activities around that idea, some examples of the use of that technology. Who knew? Actually going and finding out if someone wants to buy your idea, to have an idea of where it might be used, some end user consultation. That is involved in the protection of the IP. And so it might sound, well, why would you go and talk to someone about the idea? Because won't they just run away with it? Well, no, because you can go and have a team of people who you've created that idea with, who are part and parcel of the future journey of that intellectual property as part of your trusted network. And they'll then help you word your patent if you're going down the patent path to ensure that you're future protecting that piece of intellectual property. But then again, a single idea is useless. It's not transactable. You need a family of intellectual property to actually create a future vehicle that's sustainable. And that's where we need to then acknowledge a single idea from a single person in a single lab probably needs to be coupled with someone who might be across the road and I'm thumbing across back to the medical building that's right behind me, or I can throw across the road to my physicist and chemist colleagues.
Yes.
We need that coupling of that intellectual property together. Now, that is scary. It's challenging because it means that we have to have trust embedded within the scientific process. Now, some ways we can start evolving that is using things like blockchain to start backing our data and ideas up through blockchain and transmission of evidence out there in a protected and linkable fashion if it is ever used in the future. Those kinds of technologies, those kinds of solutions, those are exciting things I can see into the future as we evolve beyond just open publishing, but open data access that is protected using current best practice technologies in the banking sector, for example.
Yes. I think that's such a brilliant idea, Mark, and I've not heard that before, but proposed to use blockchain, NFT technology, but I think that would be a very interesting way forward to protect intellectual property when the move is to make data open, but to, again, protect intellectual property, whether it's commercial or culturally sensitive. And we've talked about the Australian situation, but thinking sort of internationally, how does Australia compare with other countries, and do you look to other countries to benchmark what they're doing around science and technology?
We do. Australia is an island nation. There's less than 30 million of us down here. We are spread out a long way, and as I'm sure you know, Martin, it's a hell of a long flight to come down here. So we cannot do everything down here. We are one of the most internationally connected communities of scientists and technologists in terms of our collaborations on publications. That is our strength. We know how to work as teams. We know how to work at long distance as a team. So our long-term relationships are very, very good. If anything, during COVID, that has enhanced the capabilities of the Australian sector because we've all got very au fait with this online communication platforms, Zoom or Teams or whatever you wanted to use. That has meant that everybody's sort of leveled up in terms of that long-term collaboration, long-distance collaboration. But I think that's the challenge. Everybody else has learned how to do that now. Everybody's realised that, Australia's been doing this forever. Why haven't we been doing this? Boom. We need to now ensure in the next few years that we in Australia are on the front foot in ensuring we've consolidated those long-term, long-distance relationships with the ability to do some pressing of the flesh face-to-face meetings. It's funny, I still remember I was in a meeting down in New Orleans before the big event down there with the climate destroying the place for a while. And I was at a cafe. And this bloke who was I think he was an engineer, and for some reason we got chatting, and I was like, yeah, I'm a scientist, I'm here for a conference. He's like, what is it with you bloody Australians? You're everywhere, and you're always at these conferences. And it made me reflect, yes, a decent proportion of the Australian academic science and technology community are on the road every day of the week, presenting and engaging at conferences, and most of the time it's international. So we need to keep that connection there. Some of the uniquenesses about the Australian sector are both our strengths and our weakness. The strength is we're a highly integrated, connected community of scientists and technologists because of our scale. The problem is that we don't have necessarily the scale in every single area to be excellent at absolutely everything with mass funding to then support all of those areas of excellence. And that's a challenge. And that's a dialogue that we continue with Science and Technology Australia to advocate for more government support, public support, industry support to elevate what unfortunately is a dwindling GDP investment into R&D to crank us up to what's happening, for example, in the UK, in Israel. We are well below the 2%. In fact, I think we're at 1.72, 1.79, somewhere about that. You're almost at 3 or above 3 now. Israel's way up. South Korea's way up. We need to increase that fundamental science investment to enable the pipeline of future translation and solutions. So I think that's where then, when we're looking at what we can do uniquely here in Australia, we can uniquely create this convergence science discovery, but critically then, the distinction is we can create a convergent science translation. So a piece of technology that comes out of ag tech is dual created and dual intellectual property protected for med tech, defense tech, ag tech, envirotech, and dare I say, space tech for the future use in those very exciting and unique environments. And I think that's a uniqueness we have. And it's going to be exciting to see what's enabled in the next 10 years, because we are the place where the current solar panel technology was invented. We've lost the industrialized production capabilities there. We have some of the best battery technology that's coming through. We need to secure that manufacturing here in the country so we can actually create the jobs that then allow for the return on investment for more research. We are leading the way in quantum technologies. My goodness, this is such an exciting space. I see we might have the quantum valley over in the East Coast around brilliant Michelle Simmons and the team in quantum there for the processing. But I know just across the road here with my physics friends, we've got some of the world's best quantum sensor technologies that are just exquisite at exploring new measurement capabilities. So there's so much going on. We just need to go and convert some of these brilliant ideas, and in the future, ensure we've got convergent translation.
Absolutely, and that's beautifully articulated as well. I've had the advantage and joy of being an international publisher, being traveling around the world, United States, Europe, Asia, and Australia. And what really struck me over the last 10 years is how, despite the percentage of GDP funding for Australian science not being where it might be in comparison to other countries, but what you do is you pack a punch above your weight, because in science communications, in my opinion, I've seen some fantastic examples of just what you've been discussing over the last 30 minutes. You're translating complex science into real-world applications. And so the science communications bit for me is missing in many UK, European and North American institutions, despite the significant levels of funding and the amazing research that's being done. Doing fantastic research is good, but it's not as good as being able to then translate that through science communications. I know you've worked with science communication experts in Australia. We Carly Ahern at STEM Matters. I've connected with her through my podcast last year, so we've got a sense for how science communicators in Australia really do well in communicating the fantastic science that's going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Having experienced science in the US, in Europe, and here at home in Australia, we love telling the simple story in a scientific publication that we think is simple, linear path that is inaccessible in most of the time to any other of our own scientific peers from another discipline, let alone to the general community. I've had my science communication indelibly formed by people like Carly Ahern, reflecting, I'm chatting to her about the scientific discoveries, and she says, well, I think what you mean, Mark, is this. It's like, yeah, write that down, Carly. That's what I mean. But in that engagement, I'm suddenly thinking, why the hell did I just spend 20 minutes telling that story that I thought was interesting? It was stroking my own ego, and Carly tells it in 2 sentences as higher value, higher quality comms. I was like, damn it, I need to do that. And if I reflect back on what the Indigenous peoples here in Australia have done, they have been good custodians of their own histories. They have shared knowledge with stories. They have shared knowledge integrated with country around them. We don't do that well. we need to learn from these ancient knowledge systems of sharing knowledge and of augmenting the way that we work together and embedding knowledge sharing and storytelling and sharing of country and knowledge more broadly to actually integrate our learning systems. Because as a neuroscientist at heart, I'm fascinated by augmented learning and the fundamental neurobiology. And we now know that many of us, I know myself included, if I read something, smell something, hear something, and am doing something that's all integrated together in an acquisition of knowledge, I integrate that knowledge and I remember it and I can apply it better into the future. Cultural traditions around learning and knowledge acquisition, we've just distilled it down to the 2 dimensions of a black and white page most of the time. And if you're online printing, then maybe you can have a color graph if you're lucky. But we've lost that culture of learning and integrated learning. And I think that's where we need to sort of be moving in the future. And I'm excited about learning these traditional knowledge systems and how knowledge systems can have been evolved and maintained for 40,000 years without a digital presence. Now, if we can then learn cultural sensitivity to adopt some of these practices and work on them into the future with our Indigenous brothers and sisters here in Australia, watch out, rest of the world, because we're going to come up with a brand new way to talk about quantum systems that incorporates this, dare I say, dance, community, smell, sound, as well as the knowledge of what it means to have a qubit processing banking information that's safe, secure, and at a speed that we've never appreciated before. And that is then being instilled in our children at really young ages. That's I think where, it may sound like a grand vision, but actually no, I think that's where learning and education systems are going to need to go to simply wrap our heads around this complex, fantastic, exciting world that we're creating into the future together.
Thank you, Mark, for this fantastic conversation. It's been great. I have one sort of leave question for you, which is to, if we look ahead to the next 12 months, from you and also in Australian science technology generally, what should we be looking out for over the next 12 months?
So we have in the next 12 months here broadly at the Australian sector, we have the launch of the new Australian Economic Accelerator package from the current government. That's $2.2 billion worth of research translation. Watch out for hundreds, I'm talking hundreds of startup companies being enabled out of universities to translate. The venture capital entrepreneur sector is going to be flooded by these wonderful Aussies out there seeking more investment and sharing of knowledge and expertise using brilliant expertise in SciComm and TechComm. That's going to happen in the next 12 months. We have the implementation of the future science vision for the current government, and that's going to be really exciting to see how that then distills down into an integrated science vision from science and technology vision from the government. That, hopefully, I'm advocating for more investments into fundamental science and discovery so we can crank that pipeline through. We can keep people employed in this space. I see opportunities around this, the merging of science and technology solutions that cover defence, ag and medtech. And there's some really exciting new things that are going to come through in 2023 where we have the first partnerships. The gold for me is to see the Deputy Prime Minister, who's the Minister for Defence, the Science Minister, the Health Minister, the Industry Minister, and the Prime Minister standing on a paddock and then moving straight to a wet lab, straight into a quantum lab, straight into a boardroom, and a connected media circle that then tells this story of science and technology enabling our elected officials to claim their part of the glory because they perhaps gave the policy and the funding to enable it, but to get that story out there. And I think we will see that in 2023. And for me personally, we're just super excited by the research program we've got going at the moment, where we are making the world's first measurements of objectively measuring pain. So we've got blood tests that we're using to measure pain in livestock, so cattle, beef cattle, sheep, and in pigs. That's giving us the ability for the first time to say, this is how much pain this animal is in. We don't speak their language, but we're speaking their molecular cellular language. And we're going to have the first range of publications coming out from that large bodies of work this year, which for us has immediate ag tech applications. But because we're going the convergence translation path, hello medtech, hello defense tech, we'll immediately wrap into those and start those up towards the end of 23. So it's already mid-February, whenever this goes live, excited for that. But, I'm already exhausted and we're at the beginning of the year. I'm just holding on with fingertips at the moment to keep up with my brilliant team to then keep consuming the amazing volumes of science and tech coming through.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your brilliant vision and passion for science, which clearly there's so much excitement around what you're doing. It's wonderful that you can share that, share a little of that through our podcast here. So thank you very much for your time, Mark. Maybe we'll come back in 12 months' time and see how you're doing. But for the moment, Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.